There is something deeply strange about a 620-foot ship that has sat abandoned since the mid-20th century. So many questions surround it. What was it actually built to do? And if it once served a real purpose, why was it never scrapped or destroyed? But the biggest question of all is this: why hasn't it fallen apart? Over the years, plenty of theories have circulated, and the most popular one is that this is some kind of cover-up. So today, we are answering all of it. Why this ship was built, why it was never torn apart, and why, after all these decades, it still hasn't rotted into the river. Let's get into it. To answer any of that, we have to go back to a shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, in the middle of World War II. Because this ship did not start out as a mystery. It started out as one of the most important pieces of machinery in the entire American war effort. In 1942, the United States Maritime Commission needed ships, lots of them, fast. The war effort depended on raw materials moving across the country at a pace the existing fleet could not handle. Think iron ore, coal, and limestone. All of it needed to keep American steel mills running around the clock to build tanks, ships, and weapons. The Commission ordered a batch of bulk cargo carriers built specifically to keep that supply chain moving on the Great Lakes. One of those ships had its keel laid on September 24, 1942. It launched on May 8, 1943, under the name McIntyre, named after an iron ore mine in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. It was 620 feet long, built to haul more than 16,000 tons of cargo in a single trip. This was not some small barge. This was a serious piece of wartime machinery, and it was just getting started. The ship did not stay the McIntyre for long. Within months, it was renamed Frank Purnell, after the president of Youngstown Sheet and Tube, one of the major steel producers feeding America's war machine. For more than 2 decades, it hauled iron ore and raw materials across the Great Lakes, doing exactly what it was built to do. Then, in 1965, Bethlehem Steel bought it and renamed it the Steelton. Under this name, the ship became one of the true workhorses of the Great Lakes, carrying iron ore, coal, and limestone between the industrial ports that powered the American Midwest. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago depended on ships exactly like this one to keep their furnaces fed. This was not a forgotten vessel. This was the backbone of an entire regional economy. But every ship has a moment where its luck almost runs out. This one's came in August of 1974. While traveling without cargo through the Welland Canal in Ontario, the Steelton failed to clear a rising bridge in time and crashed directly into it. The collision was severe enough to collapse the bridge entirely, shutting the canal down for 15 days. The bridge was deemed too expensive to rebuild and was never replaced. The ship somehow survived. It went through significant repairs and modifications and went right back to work. So by this point, what we have is a ship with real history, decades of purpose, a bridge collision that should have ended its career, and it kept going anyway. But the next chapter is where things start to change in a way nobody could undo, because the industry that gave this ship its entire reason for existing was about to disappear. By the late 1970s, the American steel industry was collapsing. Mills closed across the Midwest, one after another. Demand for the raw materials this ship had spent its life hauling started drying up fast. And just like that, the Steelton's future as a working cargo freighter was no longer guaranteed. So, in 1978, the ship was sold to a cement transit company, owned by Medusa Portland Cement, for roughly $1 million. Here is where the story takes its first real turn. The plan was not to scrap the ship. It was to give it an entirely new identity. The Steelton was renamed Hull Number 3 and converted into a self-unloading cement carrier, which is basically a vessel that could store and transfer cement instead of iron ore. The ship changed hands several more times through 1978 and 1979, briefly becoming the Pioneer, before finally settling under the name it still carries today, CTC Number 1, which stands for Cement Transit Company, Number 1. In 1982, the CTC Number 1 was towed into the port of Chicago and moored on the Calumet River, right next to a massive grain elevator complex, just off the Bishop Ford Expressway. And here is the detail that matters most. It stopped being a ship that went anywhere. It became a stationary floating container. Cement pumped in, held, pumped out. Infrastructure that happened to float. For 27 years, that arrangement actually worked. The CTC Number 1 sat in its spot doing exactly what it was repurposed to do, mostly unnoticed by anyone outside the port. Then, in 2009, the cement operation ended, and the ship simply stayed exactly where it was. It is still there right now, as you are watching this. That is the moment everything changes. Because what happened next is not really a story about a ship anymore. It is a story about silence, and what people do when nobody gives them an answer. This is the part of the story where most people who've actually heard of the CTC Number 1 pick up the thread. Because from the outside, what happened after 2009 looked less like a logistics problem and more like a genuine mystery. The ship did not get towed away. It did not get scrapped. It did not get sold for parts. It just sat at its moorings, visible to anyone driving north on the Bishop Ford Expressway, slowly rusting in plain sight for years. The Port of Chicago itself had become something of a forgotten relic by this point, still technically running, still moving millions of tons of cargo every year, but basically invisible to the city around it. And sitting right in the middle of that invisible port was this enormous rusting ship that everybody could see but nobody could explain. In 2015, a Chicago public radio station got a question from a listener who'd spotted the ship while out boating on the Calumet River. She joked to her uncle that it looked haunted, but she genuinely wanted to know, what is the deal with that ship? And here's the thing, she wasn't the only one asking. Multiple people sent in the exact same question over the years. Nobody had a clear answer for any of them. That is exactly the kind of vacuum that breeds conspiracy. Give people something massive and unexplained, and they will not just shrug and move on. They will fill in the blanks themselves. So the theories started stacking up. Some people were convinced there was a legal dispute freezing the ship in place. Say, an estate fight, an unresolved lawsuit, something tangled up in court for decades. Others assumed there had to be a financial crime buried somewhere in the story. Insurance fraud, a hidden liability everyone wanted to quietly forget about. And a few of the more dramatic theories went even further, suggesting that authorities simply did not want whatever was sitting in the ship's holds to be disturbed, as if something was being deliberately hidden in plain sight. And then urban explorers got inside, and what they found only made things worse. They described an atmosphere of unsettling stillness, engine rooms and control stations that looked like they should still be running, frozen exactly the way they were left the day operations stopped, completely undisturbed for 30 years. That is the exact kind of setting horror movies are built from. It is genuinely easy to see why people walked away from this ship convinced it was haunted. But here's the part nobody expected. When journalists and researchers actually dug into the real story, what they found was almost the opposite of dramatic. The truth is that there was no legal cover-up or buried crime. Definitely no hidden cargo, nobody is allowed to see. The CTC Number 1 is not stuck because of a conspiracy. It is stuck because of basic economics, and once you hear the numbers, the mystery falls apart almost instantly. Here is the actual chain of facts. In December 2010, the ship was acquired by Grand River Navigation, a shipping company operating a fleet across the Great Lakes. They did not buy it to put it back into service. By most accounts, they bought it as a kind of low-cost insurance policy, or a vessel that could theoretically be restored to working condition someday if they ever needed the extra capacity, without spending serious money maintaining it in the meantime. That one detail changes everything. The ship is not abandoned in any legal sense. It has an owner and a registered status. What it does not have is a job, or an owner motivated enough to either restore it or finally get rid of it. And getting rid of it is where the real obstacle shows up. Because the CTC Number 1 was built in 1942 and operated for decades through the mid-20th century, it contains asbestos, which is the standard insulation material for that era, and now classified as a serious health hazard. Scrapping a ship this size means removing and disposing of asbestos and other hazardous materials under strict environmental regulations, hiring specialized contractors trained to handle it safely, and absorbing real labor costs before a single piece of steel is even worth anything as scrap. On top of that, the ship has no working engine. It cannot move under its own power. Towing a powerless 620-foot vessel anywhere requires specialized tugboats, marine logistics, permits, and insurance, which are all expensive, and that's before the actual scrapping even starts. In November 2019, Grand River Navigation did announce a plan to finally tow the ship out and scrap it, with cost estimates landing around $1 million for the whole process. That plan never happened. The math simply did not work out in a way that made acting on it worth more than just leaving the ship exactly where it was, paying modest dockage fees, and letting the insurance policy logic continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the Illinois International Port District, which owns the property the ship sits on, has its own headaches. We are talking about limited funding, competing priorities, and basic dock repairs that have always taken precedence over forcing a private ship owner's hand. Removing the neighboring grain elevator alone has been estimated at around $17 million, a number that puts the cost of dealing with the ship into real perspective. Nobody with the authority to force a resolution has had the budget or the urgency to actually do it. So that explains why it's still there. But it does not explain the other half of the mystery. Why, after 30 years of total neglect, this thing is not falling apart. And that answer is sitting right underneath it, in the water itself. Salt water is brutally corrosive to steel. Ships that spend their working lives in ocean environments deteriorate structurally far faster than ships built for fresh water. But the Great Lakes, where the ship sits, are fresh water, which has a massive effect on how long steel vessels actually last. Researchers have found that freighters built for Great Lakes service can survive nearly 3 times longer than comparable ships built for saltwater, simply because the corrosion process moves so much slower in fresh water. That is the answer to the question we opened with. The surface of the CTC Number 1 is rusted and streaked, exactly what 30 years of neglect should look like. But the hull underneath has not failed. It does not need to be sound enough to sail again. It just needs to be sound enough to keep sitting there, and in fresh water, that is a remarkably low bar to clear. So now we have all of it. Why it was built, why it never got scrapped, and why it still hasn't rotted into the river. The only thing left is what all of that actually adds up to. There is a pattern that shows up again and again with abandoned infrastructure. And the CTC Number 1 is one of the clearest examples of it anywhere in the country. When something large, visible, and unexplained sits in public view for decades, people do not simply shrug and move on. They fill the silence with their own theories. A legal dispute, a financial crime, something authorities do not want disturbed, because none of those explanations require any evidence. They just require enough time and enough unanswered curiosity to take root. The real story is this: a ship built to serve a wartime economy, repurposed twice as that economy changed underneath it, and finally retired into a kind of limbo, where removing it costs more than anyone with the authority to act has ever been willing to spend. So there is no villain here, no cover-up, just an owner holding onto a low-cost asset, a port district with other priorities, and a removal process expensive enough that doing nothing kept winning out over doing something, year after year. That is the actual failure, not a dramatic collapse, a slow accumulation of nobody having quite enough reason to fix a problem everyone could plainly see. The ship did not need a conspiracy to stay stuck. It just needed 30 years of small, individually reasonable decisions to do nothing at all. The CTC Number 1 is still there right now, still visible from the Bishop Ford Expressway, still rusting on the surface while its hull holds steady underneath. Whether it finally gets towed away, scrapped for parts, or just left to keep aging in place is still an open question, one that has already outlasted multiple announced plans to solve it. If you learned something new today, hit that like button so others like you can find this video.